The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, and through the small window of her log cabin, Helmi Virtanen could see her neighbors' chimneys belching desperate smoke as families burned through their winter wood supplies trying to stay alive. Inside her clay room, her 3 children slept peacefully under a single wool blanket, while a small oil lantern flickered against walls that glowed with absorbed warmth. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. Helmi Virtanen found her husband on the morning of February 9, 1856. Mikko lay on the cabin floor near the fireplace, his body rigid beneath 2 wool blankets. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped below freezing despite the log walls and chinked gaps. She knelt beside him and already knew. His skin was gray, his lips blue. He had gone to sleep 3 feet from a fire that had consumed half a cord of wood the previous day, and the cold had killed him anyway. Helmi sat beside Mikko's body for an hour before she could move. Their 3 children still slept in the loft. Aino was 8, Esko 6, Lisa only 4. They had survived the night because warm air rose to the loft space. Mikko had slept on the ground floor, where cold air pooled and sank through every gap. She buried him that afternoon on a hillside overlooking their homestead. The ground was frozen 18 inches down. She built a fire on the burial spot, let it burn for 3 hours to thaw the earth, then dug with a pickaxe and shovel. The work took until dark. She marked the grave with stones and returned to the cabin. That night, Helmi could not sleep. She lay in the darkness listening to the wind press against the log walls. She could feel cold air moving through the cabin like water, finding every gap, every crack, every weakness. The fireplace radiated heat upward and out the chimney. The warmth never reached the floor. Cold air sank and pooled where people slept. She understood something in those dark hours. The cabin that Mikko had built, the cabin that looked strong by frontier standards, was a death trap. The notched corners leaked air. The chinking contracted in extreme cold, opening gaps. The single-room design with its high ceiling meant heat rose uselessly while cold settled where it could kill. Most frontier families accepted this as the nature of winter survival. You burned wood constantly. You slept close to fires. You lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Sometimes you lost children or elderly family members to the cold. It was understood as the price of living in the Northern Territories. Helmi refused to accept it. Mikko was dead because their shelter was inadequate. If she did nothing, the same cold would eventually kill her children. Standard cabin construction was not enough. She rose before dawn and walked to the root cellar they had dug into the hillside the previous autumn. She opened the door and stepped inside. The temperature was noticeably warmer than the exterior air, perhaps 20 degrees warmer. The earthen walls held heat from the ground itself. The small enclosed space required no fire to stay above freezing. She remembered clay ovens from Finland, massive structures that absorbed heat from wood fires and radiated warmth for hours after the flames died. She thought about pottery, how clay hardened in kilns became dense and capable of holding heat. Clay, earth, thermal mass, small enclosed spaces. These concepts began connecting in her mind. She would build something involving clay, something small that would hold heat. She would not let winter kill her children the way it had killed their father. Spring came late to the Montana Territory in 1856. Snow lingered until mid-April, then melted in a sudden thaw. While other settlers planted crops and repaired cabins, Helmi Virtanen walked the creek banks examining mud. She was looking for clay. Not all earth was suitable. Sandy soil crumbled when dry. Pure clay cracked as it dried. She needed something specific. She started at the creek nearest her cabin. The banks rose 6 feet above the water level, exposing layers of soil. She dug into these layers with a stick, pulling out samples, squeezing them, feeling the texture. Some samples felt gritty, dominated by sand. Others felt smooth and plastic, pure clay that stuck to her fingers. She collected both types in a wooden bucket and carried them home. Over the next week, she conducted experiments. She mixed clay samples with water in different ratios, forming them into small balls. She let them dry in the sun. Most cracked within 2 days. Pure clay dried unevenly, the surface hardening while the interior remained wet, creating fractures. Sandy mixtures dried without cracking but crumbled easily. She remembered her grandmother mixing straw into clay for building. The straw provided structure, tiny fibers that held the clay together. Helmi chopped dried grass into half-inch pieces and kneaded it into wet clay. The mixture held together better when dried. She experimented with ratios, 3 parts clay to 1 part sand with straw, 2 parts clay to 1 part sand, equal parts with less straw. She formed each mixture into balls, let them dry, then dropped them from shoulder height onto a flat rock. Pure clay balls shattered. Sandy balls crumbled. But the mixture with 2 parts clay, 1 part coarse sand, and chopped straw survived with only minor cracks. She made 10 more balls with this ratio. 8 survived. This was her formula. She spent another week refining the technique, testing moisture levels and drying times. She built small test patches on flat rocks, layering the clay mixture 3 inches thick, letting each layer dry partially before adding the next. By early May, she needed to test heat retention. She built a pimbiti, small fire pit surrounded by rocks, then covered the rocks with her clay mixture, building up walls 6 inches thick in a circle 2 feet across. She let it dry for a week, then built a fire inside and let it burn for 4 hours. After the fire died to coals, she placed her hand near the clay walls. They radiated heat strongly. She extinguished the coals and waited. 2 hours later, the clay still felt warm. 4 hours later, warmth remained. 6 hours after the fire had died, residual heat lingered. This was what she needed. Clay absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. A large mass of properly mixed clay could store warmth, heat it during the day, and it would radiate through the coldest night. Her neighbors noticed her activities. Terttu Laaksonen found Helmi kneeling beside clay-covered rocks, hands black with mud. She asked if Helmi was making pottery. Helmi said no, testing clay for building. Terttu suggested she should remarry. A woman alone cannot manage a homestead. Helmi continued testing the clay. She needed to keep her children alive through next winter. That evening, Terttu mentioned Helmi's behavior to other families. Oscar Lindgren laughed openly. "The widow is playing in mud like a child," he said. "Grief has broken her mind." By late May, Helmi had a clear vision of what she needed to build. Not a full cabin, but a small, dedicated space designed solely for warmth. A clay room where her children could sleep through the coldest nights while using minimal fuel. She selected a location against the north wall of the existing cabin. Building there would provide structural support on one side. The spot received no direct sunlight in winter, which most builders would consider a disadvantage. Helmi saw it differently. A space that stayed consistently cold would benefit most from thermal mass heating. She paced out dimensions on the ground, 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, small enough to heat efficiently, large enough for 3 children to sleep comfortably. She would build the walls 8 feet tall at the highest point, creating enough headroom to stand inside. She sketched rough plans using charcoal on pieces of birch bark. The exterior would be a simple rectangular structure built from salvaged logs and stones. The innovation would be invisible from outside, hidden in the interior construction. Inside this rectangular shell, she would line every surface with thick clay, not just the walls, but the ceiling as well, shaping it into a curved dome-like form. Curved surfaces distributed warmth more evenly than flat ones. Heat rose naturally. A curved ceiling would guide that heat outward and downward along the walls rather than letting it pool uselessly at the peak. The clay would be 12 inches thick on the walls, slightly less on the ceiling where weight became a concern. She calculated the volume needed. Approximately 1,200 pounds of prepared clay mixture. 1,200 pounds meant roughly 800 pounds of raw clay. 300 pounds of sand, and the rest water and chopped straw. The materials would come from the creek bank, requiring hundreds of trips carrying buckets. She could manage 20 pounds per trip. That meant at least 60 trips just for the clay and sand, plus countless more for water. She would work in batches, preparing enough clay mixture for one day's application, letting it cure, then preparing the next batch. The clay had to be fresh and workable when applied. The door would be simple wood planks, small, but sealed tightly to trap heat inside. She would add a ventilation hole near the roof peak, just 2 inches across. Enough to prevent suffocation, but too small to lose significant warmth. She would install a raised sleeping platform 18 inches off the ground. Warm air rose, so sleeping elevated would be warmer than sleeping on the floor. The platform would span the width of the room, providing space for all 3 children. For heat, she would use an oil lantern placed on the floor in the center. Oil burned cleanly and steadily. A single lantern could burn for 8 to 10 hours. The flame would heat the air, which would rise and warm the clay ceiling. The clay would absorb that heat and radiate it back down. Even after the lantern was extinguished, the clay would continue radiating warmth for hours. She had no formal education in engineering or architecture, but she understood heat, cold, and survival. She knew clay held warmth. She knew small spaces heated efficiently. She knew her children's lives depended on this working. She began hauling clay from the creek the next morning. Helmi began building the outer frame in early June. She salvaged logs from a collapsed shed on the property, cutting them to 6-foot lengths. The logs were weathered but still solid. She set corner posts into shallow holes, then stacked horizontal logs between them, creating a rectangular box against the cabin's north wall. The construction was crude but functional. She notched the logs roughly where they met, filling gaps with stones and mud. This outer structure did not need to be perfect. It simply needed to provide a frame and weather protection for the clay work that would happen inside. The work was slow. She could manage only a few hours each day before exhaustion forced her to rest. Her hands blistered from handling rough logs. Her back ached from lifting timber. Eno and Esco helped where they could, carrying smaller stones. Lisa stayed close, handing her mother tools. Neighbors passed by periodically. Helmi's building project became a topic of conversation and amusement. Oscar Lindgren stopped one afternoon while Helmi was wrestling a log into position. He sat on his horse watching her struggle before speaking. "Building a smokehouse?" he asked. "No," Helmi said, not looking up. "Looks like a smokehouse, or maybe a chicken coop." "It is neither." "What then?" "A room for winter." Oscar laughed. "You have a cabin already?" "A good cabin, your husband built. Why waste time on this? The cabin is not warm enough. Then burn more wood. That is what normal people do." Helmi set down the log and looked at him directly. "Normal people freeze." Oscar shook his head and rode away. That evening at the trading post, he told others about the widow building a shed to live in. The story spread quickly. Pastor Toivonen visited 2 days later. He found Helmi mixing clay in a large wooden trough, her arms covered in gray mud. Piles of clay, sand, and chopped straw lay nearby. The rectangular frame stood completed behind her, looking rough and unimpressive. "Sister Virtanen, the community's concerned," he said. "This project seems unwise." "It is necessary," Helmi replied, continuing to mix. "A woman alone should not attempt such work. You should accept help. Remarry, perhaps. Your children need a father. My children need warmth. I am providing it." "With mud?" Pastor Toivonen gestured at the clay mixture. "This is not rational thinking. Grief can cloud judgment. The church did not keep Mikko alive through winter. Clay will keep my children alive." The pastor left, troubled. He mentioned Helmi's state of mind to other families. The consensus grew that the widow had been broken by loss and was wasting time on foolish projects. Terttu Laaksonen visited in late June. She brought bread and stayed to watch Helmi work. The outer frame was finished. Helmi had begun applying clay to the interior walls, spreading the thick mixture with her hands, pressing it firmly against the log frame. "Why are you doing this?" Tertu asked quietly. "To survive next winter." "But this is just mud, Helmi. Mud walls. How can this be better than a proper cabin?" "Proper cabins kill people," Helmi said. "This will save them." Tertu looked at the gray clay coating the interior walls, at Helmi's cracked and bleeding hands, at the children playing nearby. She felt pity and confusion. "People are saying you have lost your mind," Tertu said gently. "People can say what they wish." Helmi applied another handful of clay, smoothing it carefully. "When winter comes, my children will be warm." The clay application began in early July and would consume the entire summer. Helmi worked systematically, building up the interior walls in layers. Each layer needed to be 3 inches thick, applied evenly and allowed to cure before the next could be added. She started with the back wall. She mixed her first batch of clay in the wooden trough, combining 2 parts clay, 1 part coarse sand, and chopped straw. She added water gradually, kneading the mixture until it reached the consistency of thick bread dough. The mixing took 2 hours. When ready, she carried the clay into the frame in handfuls and began pressing it against the log wall. She worked from bottom to top, spreading evenly, pushing firmly into every gap. The clay had to bond completely with the underlying structure. Air pockets would create weak points. She used her palms to press the clay flat, then used a flat piece of wood to create an even surface. A single 3-inch layer covering the back wall required 40 pounds of prepared clay mixture. By midday, her first layer was complete. The gray surface was uneven but solid. It would take 3 full days to cure enough for the next layer. She repeated this process for each wall. Mix clay, apply layer, smooth surface, wait 3 days. Each wall would receive 4 layers, building up to 12 inches total. The waiting was difficult. She wanted to work continuously, but the clay dictated the pace. During her second week, impatience led her to apply a layer after only 2 days. The clay developed hairline cracks within hours. She had to scrape it off and start again. After that failure, she respected the curing time absolutely. 3 days between layers, no exceptions. The summer heat helped. Temperatures rose into the 80s during July, and the clay dried faster. She kept the door opening covered with canvas to prevent rain, but left gaps for air circulation. By mid-August, the walls were complete. 4 layers on each wall, 12 inches thick. The interior space had shrunk considerably. What had been 6 feet wide was now 5 feet wide. 8 feet deep was now 7 feet deep. But the massive clay walls created exactly what she needed: thermal mass capable of storing and radiating heat. The ceiling presented a greater challenge, but applying clay overhead required supporting it while it cured. She built a temporary wooden framework inside, creating a curved form that would support the clay layers. The curve was gentle, rising from the walls to a peak about 7 feet high. She applied ceiling clay in thinner layers, 2 inches instead of 3, to reduce weight. Each layer took longer because she had to work overhead, arms raised, clay dripping onto her face. She completed 3 layers on the ceiling, creating 6 inches of thickness. By early September, the clay work was finished. She removed the temporary wooden supports carefully. The ceiling held. She had created a small room with massive clay walls and a curved clay ceiling. The interior was dim, cave-like, and smelled of damp earth. Now she needed the final surface. The clay walls were complete but rough. The surface showed fingerprints, tool marks, and irregular patches where layers met. Helmi needed a smooth interior finish that would maximize radiant heat reflection. Rough surfaces absorbed and scattered heat. Smooth surfaces reflected it back into the space. She prepared a different clay mixture for the final layer. She collected the finest clay from the creek bank, material that felt almost silky between her fingers. She mixed it with very fine sand, barely gritty, and no straw. The mixture was thinner than what she had used for the structural layers, more like thick cream than dough. She applied this finishing clay with her bare hands, using her palms in circular motions to spread it across the rough interior walls. The thin layer filled small gaps and irregularities, creating a uniform surface. She worked in sections, completing one area before moving to the next. The smoothing required patience. She could not rush the circular motions or press too hard. Too much pressure would create grooves. Too little would leave bumps. She developed a rhythm, her palms moving steadily across the clay, feeling for imperfections, correcting them as she worked. Her hands cramped after the first hour. The repetitive circular motion strained muscles in her forearms and wrists. She took breaks, flexing her fingers, shaking out her arms, then returned to work. Each wall took a full day to smooth completely. The finishing layer dried differently than the structural clay. Because it was thin and fine, it dried quickly, sometimes too quickly. If the surface dried before she finished smoothing a section, it would harden with an uneven texture. She learned to work in early morning, when humidity was higher and drying slower. She discovered that adding a small amount of rendered animal fat to the finishing mixture made it easier to work and created a slightly water-resistant surface. She had a small amount of bear fat saved from a trade the previous year. She melted a spoonful over low heat and mixed it into a batch of finishing clay. The fat made the mixture more pliable and gave it a subtle sheen when dry. She used this fat-enriched mixture on the final pass over each wall, applying the thinnest possible layer and polishing it with her palms until it gleamed faintly in the dim light. The result was a surface that felt almost like fired pottery, smooth and slightly cool to the touch. The sealing required different technique because she had to work overhead. She applied the finishing mixture more thickly there, allowing gravity to help it adhere. She smoothed upward in sweeping motions, her arms aching from the extended overhead work. Clay dripped onto her face and hair. She worked in short sessions, completing small sections at a time. By late September, the entire interior was smooth. She stood in the center of the small room and ran her hands along the walls. The surface was uniform, cool, and solid. She could feel no gaps, no rough patches, no weak points. The curved ceiling rose above her, its smooth surface ready to reflect heat downward when winter came. The clay room was nearly complete. Only the door, ventilation, and sleeping platform remained. October arrived with cool nights and frost on the ground at dawn. Helmi installed the final elements of the clay room. She built a simple wooden door from planks salvaged from the old shed, fitting it tightly into the entrance frame. She carved a small ventilation hole near the ceiling peak, just 2 inches across, and covered it with a wooden plug she could remove when needed. She constructed a sleeping platform from split logs, raising it 18 inches off the floor on sturdy supports. The platform spanned the width of the room, creating space for all 3 children to sleep side by side. She covered it with pine boughs and a layer of dried grass for cushioning. With construction complete, she needed to test the clay room's heat retention before winter arrived. She could not risk her children's lives on theory alone. The system had to work. She placed an oil lantern in the center of the floor and lit it. The flame burned steadily, casting warm light against the gray clay walls. She closed the door and waited outside, checking the interior every 30 minutes. After 2 hours, the clay walls felt slightly warm to her touch. After 4 hours, they radiated noticeable heat. After 6 hours, the entire interior felt warm, the air temperature comfortable even though the exterior temperature had dropped to near freezing with nightfall. She extinguished the lantern and continued monitoring. The clay continued radiating heat. 2 hours after extinguishing the flame, the walls still felt warm. 4 hours later, residual warmth remained. 6 hours later, she could still detect heat radiating from the clay. though it had diminished significantly. 8 hours of lantern burn time provided approximately 12 to 14 hours of warmth when accounting for the clay's stored heat radiation. This meant lighting the lantern at sunset would provide warmth through the coldest pre-dawn hours when temperatures dropped lowest. She tested different lantern positions. Placing it low and central worked best. Heat rose naturally, warming the curved ceiling first, then radiating down the walls. Placing the lantern too high wasted heat at the ceiling peak before it could warm the walls properly. She tested ventilation requirements. With the door closed and ventilation hole plugged, the oxygen level dropped noticeably after 3 hours. She felt slight breathlessness. She opened the ventilation hole and immediately fresh air circulated. The small opening was sufficient for 3 children and maintained air quality without losing significant heat. She conducted a full overnight test in late October. She lit the lantern at sunset, closed the door, plugged the ventilation hole partially, and monitored temperature throughout the night. By midnight, the interior was comfortably warm. By dawn, residual heat remained, though diminished. The test confirmed her calculations. The clay room worked. Heat from a single oil lantern, absorbed by 1,200 pounds of clay and radiated slowly over many hours, could maintain livable temperature through a cold night. The curved interior distributed warmth evenly. The thick walls prevented heat loss to the exterior. The small space required minimal fuel to warm. She was ready. When the first serious freeze arrived, her children would sleep in the clay room. They would be warm and safe, while others burned through wood supplies trying to heat drafty cabins. The innovation she had worked all summer to create would prove itself when it mattered most. The first hard freeze arrived on November 7th. Helmi woke to find ice crystals coating the inside of the cabin windows. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 8 below zero overnight. Her breath formed clouds in the cabin air, despite the banked coals in the fireplace. She prepared the clay room immediately. She lit the oil lantern and placed it in the center of the floor. She opened the small ventilation hole halfway. She laid wool blankets on the sleeping platform and brought in the children's warmest clothes. Eno, Esko, and Lisa were uncertain about the small, dark space. They had watched it being built all summer, but had never slept inside. The curved clay walls and low ceiling felt strange and confining after the open cabin interior. "It looks like a cave," Esko said. "It is warmer than a cave," Helmi replied. "Come inside, you will see." She guided them onto the sleeping platform. The 3 children sat together, wrapped in blankets, watching the lantern flame flicker against the gray walls. Helmi closed the door, leaving only a small gap so they could see she remained nearby. Within an hour, the children removed their outer blankets. The air had warmed considerably. The clay walls radiated gentle heat from all directions. Unlike the cabin where heat rose to the ceiling and cold sank to the floor, the clay room maintained even temperature throughout its small space. By evening, the children were comfortable in their regular clothes. They ate dinner inside the clay room, sitting on the platform, the lantern providing both heat and light. Lisa fell asleep first, curled against her sister. Esko followed soon after. Aino stayed awake longer, running her hands along the smooth clay walls, feeling the warmth radiating from them. "The walls are warm," she said, surprised. "The clay holds heat," Helmi explained. "Like stones around a fire, it will stay warm through the night." Helmi tucked all 3 children under a single wool blanket. They did not need more. The clay room's temperature remained stable and comfortable. She adjusted the lantern flame slightly lower to conserve oil but keep the heat steady. She checked the ventilation hole and found air circulating properly. She left the children sleeping and returned to the main cabin. Through the thin wall separating the structures, she could hear nothing. The clay room was silent and sealed. She spent the night in the cabin, waking every few hours to check on the children. Each time she opened the clay room door, she found them sleeping peacefully. The interior remained warm. The lantern burned steadily. The clay walls continued radiating stored heat. By dawn, when exterior temperatures reached their lowest point at 12 below zero, the clay room maintained comfortable warmth. Outside, she could hear neighbors chopping wood in the pre-dawn darkness. Families were burning through their winter supplies, trying to keep cabins warm enough for survival. Axes rang against frozen timber. Children cried from the cold, despite fires burning constantly in every cabin. Inside Helmy's clay room, her 3 children slept through the night undisturbed, warm and safe, using a single lantern's worth of oil. January of 1857 brought the worst cold in living memory. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero on January 14th and remained there for 8 consecutive days. Ice formed on the inside of cabin walls. Water froze solid within minutes of being brought indoors. The cold was relentless and deadly. Families with standard log cabins burned wood at rates they could not sustain. Settlers who had stockpiled cords of firewood for the entire winter found themselves running dangerously low after just 4 days of extreme cold. Cabins with roaring fires still allowed cold air to sink through gaps in chinking. Children slept as close to fireplaces as safety allowed and still shivered through the nights. 2 families abandoned their cabins entirely and moved into the trading post, crowding into the single large room where combined body heat and a massive central fireplace provided better survival odds than isolated homesteads. Others sent their children to stay with relatives in town, unable to keep them safe in frontier cabins. Oscar Lindgren's family burned through 6 cords of wood in 5 days. His eldest son developed frostbite on 3 fingers despite sleeping with his hands tucked inside his shirt near the fire. Oscar spent entire days chopping frozen timber, barely staying ahead of consumption. His wife wrapped the children in every blanket they owned. It was not enough. Terttu Laksanen's youngest son, only 3 years old, developed fever on the 6th day of the freeze. The constant cold had weakened him. Terttu kept him next to the fire continuously, but he shivered and coughed. She wrapped him in wool and fur. His fever climbed. By the 8th day, she was desperate. On the evening of January 21st, Terttu appeared at Helmy's door carrying her sick son. The child was wrapped in blankets, but shaking. Terttu's face showed exhaustion and fear. "Please," she said, "I know you have built something. People say your children are warm. My son is dying from the cold." Helmy opened the door wider. "Bring him inside." She led Terttu to the clay room. The small structure looked crude from outside, barely more than a shed attached to the cabin. But when Helmy opened the door, warmth spilled out into the frozen night. Inside, Aino, Esko, and Lisa sat on the sleeping platform, comfortable and safe. The clay walls glowed faintly orange in the lantern light, radiating absorbed heat. Terttu stood in the entrance, staring. The interior was genuinely warm, not cold with a hot spot near a fire, but evenly warm throughout the entire small space. Her son stopped shivering within minutes. "How?" Terttu whispered. "The clay," Helmy said simply. "It holds the heat." Terttu touched the wall. The smooth surface radiated steady warmth. She looked at Helmy's children, none of them shivering, none huddled desperately near a fire. They looked comfortable, almost relaxed. Outside, the temperature was 20 below zero. Inside this small room lined with clay, it felt like spring. "I thought you were mad," Terttu said quietly. "All summer watching you work with mud, I thought grief had broken you." "Grief taught me," Helmy replied. "Mikko died because our cabin could not keep him warm. This keeps them warm." Terttu stayed through the night. Her son slept peacefully for the first time in days, his fever breaking before dawn. The clay room maintained its temperature using only a single oil lantern, while outside the worst freeze in memory continued its assault. Word spread quickly after that night. The freeze broke on January 22nd. Temperatures rose to 0, then climbed into the teens. Families emerged from their cabins exhausted, wood supplies depleted, children marked by frostbite. 2 elderly settlers had died during the coldest nights. Several families faced severe hardship, having burned through winter fuel with months of cold still ahead. Terttu Laksonen told everyone what she had seen. The clay room that people had mocked had kept Helmi's children warm through the worst freeze using minimal fuel. Within a week, 3 families approached Helmi asking for instruction. She shared her knowledge freely. She showed them the clay deposits. She explained her mixture ratios: 2 parts clay, 1 part coarse sand, chopped straw for binding. She described the layering technique, the 3-day curing time, the importance of smooth surfaces. By spring, construction began on 5 new clay rooms. Families built rectangular frames against cabins or dug into hillsides. They hauled clay in buckets, mixed it with sand and straw, applied it in layers. The work took months, but those who committed created warming rooms that protected their families. By the winter of 1857, 11 families had clay rooms. All followed Helmi's principles: thick clay walls, curved interiors, small spaces, oil lantern heating. Children who had shivered through previous winters slept warm. Families who had burned cords of wood now used gallons of oil. Oskar Lindgren built a clay room in 1858. He never apologized for his mockery, but he followed her technique precisely. His family survived the next winter using 1/5 the fuel. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers saw the structures and asked questions. Families moving into the territory heard stories and built their own. By the early 1860s, clay-lined winter shelters had become common across the northern frontier. Helmi lived until 1879, long enough to see her innovation become standard practice. She never claimed credit. She never named it after herself. When people asked about clay rooms, she simply explained how to build them. She died quietly on her homestead at age 61, surrounded by her grown children. She was buried next to Mikko on the hillside overlooking their land. Throughout the territory, clay rooms continued functioning for decades. Some stood into the early 1900s, their thick walls still solid. Modern historians estimate that dozens of lives were saved because families built warming rooms that could withstand extreme cold using minimal fuel. The story of Helmi Virtanen demonstrates that frontier innovation often came from necessity rather than education. She had no training in engineering. She simply refused to accept that her children should die from cold the way their father had. What settlers had mocked as mud walls proved to be one of the most effective survival technologies on the northern frontier. The crude shed that looked like foolish work contained principles most builders did not understand. Her legacy existed in the clay-lined rooms scattered across the territory, in the families who survived winters they might not have otherwise endured. She proved that earth, water, and patience could create something capable of standing against winter's fury. She changed how people survived on the American frontier, one clay-lined room at a time.